The Comandancia, Panama City, 1989. The heavy beat of the helicopter blades competes with the crackle of gunfire and explosions as you abseil down to the prison roof. The neighbouring Comandancia, the nerve centre of dictator Manuel Noriega's military, is ablaze and belching out acrid black smoke that seems to pierce your lungs. The invasion of Panama has begun, and you're a Delta Force commando tasked with rescuing an American hostage held in the most brutal prison in the whole country. As you breach the rooftop door and advance into the prison, bullets narrowly miss you and slam into the wall. You take cover as Panamanian soldiers yell, "Death to America!" You battle through the smoke-filled corridors, spotting an enemy soldier running towards the hostage's cell. He has been assigned to kill him if there's a rescue attempt. Raising your machine gun, you pump a burst of bullets into his chest. And he collapses just before the cell door. You try to shoot off the lock, but the door remains firm. Eventually, you have to blow it off its hinges. Grabbing the hostage, you retreat back to the chopper. The whole mission has taken just 6 minutes. As the chopper begins to fly away, bullets smash into it like a hailstorm, beginning to pierce the metal exterior. One of your comrades cries out and clutches his leg. Another is bleeding from his abdomen, gritting his teeth in pain. The chopper becomes unstable, the warning alarm blaring in your ears. It jerks from side to side before nose-diving towards the ground, the pilot yelling out, "We're going down!" I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Da wird uns ausgebildet. Wollen wir 4 Jahre Nazi.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. A Latin American country is being ruled by a despised dictator, dabbling in voodoo and allied to cocaine cartels, until America launches a daring operation to remove him. Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro? No, it's Panama's Manuel Noriega. If history doesn't exactly repeat itself, it certainly does rhyme. Noriega was very much a creation of the US and its Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union. A brutal thug, he had been supported by the CIA as a useful asset against communism. But now, he turned on his former masters. Cocaine was flooding into the US through Panama. The civilians and soldiers were being threatened and harassed, while he did deal after deal with America's enemies. A reckoning was now coming for the sins of the past. After Spain lost control of its mainland American colonies in the early 19th century, Panama became an isolated province of New Granada, soon to be renamed Colombia. It was very much an isolated backwater, barely populated, ravaged by malaria and yellow fever. Panama remained isolated because reaching it by land from the rest of Colombia was almost impossible. The Darien Gap, a wilderness on the border of Panama and Colombia, was a trackless tangle of mountains, jungle and swamp, almost impassable. To this day, it remains a roadless wilderness, a refuge for criminals and rebels. Yet this seemingly unpromising area had one great natural advantage. It was the narrowest land area in the Americas, between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Travelling from one ocean to the other was a difficult task for most of the 19th century, involving either a dangerous and long journey around the Cape Horn or an equally arduous trip across land. News from California reached China way before the eastern United States. But Panama had the potential to change this, especially if a railway, or maybe a canal, was built. The California Gold Rush changed the history of both the United States and Panama, beginning a process that would bind them together, as hundreds of thousands of migrants descended on the state, hoping to make their fortune. One of the most popular routes was across the Panamanian Isthmus, shaving weeks off the journey. A railroad was built, and between 1848 and 1869, 500,000 people travelled across the isthmus. Shops, whorehouses, bars, whorehouses, hotels, and even more whorehouses appeared to service their needs. Panama wasn't so remote or undeveloped anymore. It wasn't all positive news. Panama's complex relationship with the US was also forming at this time. The Panamanians liked the money and the investment, but hated the arrogance, drunkenness, and violence that came with it. US travellers had a tendency to behave like British tourists on a bender in Ibiza. It all came to a head with the excellently named Watermelon Riots in 1855. A drunken white American and a black Panamanian got into an argument over a slice of watermelon. The American, furious at a black person being cheeky to a white man, pulled out a gun. The Panamanian pulled out a knife. This soon turned into an all-out battle between locals and Americans, leaving 17 dead before it was over. For the first time, politicians in Washington, D.C. began to mutter about seizing the vital isthmus. For now, the US wasn't ready for an overseas empire. Plus, the Civil War was going to break out soon. It accepted compensation and forgot all about watermelons and riots. But the genie was out of the bottle. The idea would never quite go away. In America's absence, it was up to France to attempt to build a Panama Canal. In the 1880s, celebrity businessman Ferdinand de Lesseps stepped forward to achieve this bold feat. Having already created the Suez Canal, he had no problem finding eager investors. They should have saved their money. Thanks to rampant corruption and disease-carrying mosquitoes, the whole project ended in disaster a decade later. 20,000 workers had died, 800,000 investors were ruined, and the oceans were no closer than they'd been for 3 million years. Only after victory in the Spanish-American War and Teddy Roosevelt's rise to the presidency did the US finally decide to become involved in Panama and build a canal itself. At first, it tried to get Colombia to agree, but their proposal was rejected by Bogotá. When news arrived that Colombia had refused to ratify the treaty, reporters raced to Roosevelt's mansion on Long Island. They found the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Shelby Cullen of Illinois, fresh from a lunch with the president. The following exchange revealed what Plan B was, if you could read between the lines. "I do not think we're ready to abandon Panama just yet," he told them. "But how can the canal be built without the treaty?" asked a reporter. "Well, we might make another treaty. Not with Colombia, but with Panama," replied the senator with a small smile. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, say no more. Panama had been trying to break away from Colombia for years. There had been 5 attempts already. This time would be different, however. They had the full backing of the United States. With Colombia's attempts to crush the rebellion blocked by the US Navy, the new country of Panama joined the family of nations in 1903. There was a price to pay, however. Roosevelt hadn't helped out of the goodness of his heart. The Panama Canal rebuilt and opened for business in 1914, but it would be American property. The Canal Zone had been born. The zone was one of the strangest arrangements in history. There was nothing else quite like it. Perhaps the closest was the Suez Canal in Egypt under the British, But even there, the fig leaf of Egyptian sovereignty remained. Not so in Panama. The Canal Zone, a 10-mile wide strip of land, 5 miles on each side of the canal, was officially American territory. Panamanians were forced out of the zone, while it divided their country in two. Technically, Panamanians could cross the zone to get to the other side, but in practice, it was often a difficult and humiliating effort. The Americans living there called themselves Zonians, which sounds rather like a dodgy New Age cult. They had their own shops, schools, parks, and baseball team. They also developed a reputation for being super patriots, which is not uncommon for colonial settlers surrounded by resentful locals. One American general complained, quote, "It's the perfect place for the guy who's 150% American and 50% whiskey," end quote. Life was good for the Zonians until the 1960s. In response to Panamanian protests, President John F. Kennedy ordered that the Panamanian flag be flown in the zone alongside the Stars and Stripes. The Zonians exploded into rage. Trying to calm the anger, the local commander said no flags would be flown. This didn't go down well either. Students at Balboa High, the main American school, proudly raised Old Glory and refused to take it down, starting a round-the-clock vigil to protect their flag. The touch paper had been lit. A large Panamanian mob descended on the school, demanding their flag be raised as well, after chants of, quote, "Panamanians go home," end quote. A riot broke out. Soon it reached levels of violence not seen since the Watermelon Riot. Protesters threw Molotov cocktails and rocks, with American soldiers firing tear gas and bullets in return. Cars with Canal Zone license plates were burned, and the U.S. Embassy was stoned. When order was finally restored, 20 Panamanians and 4 Americans lay dead. It was the beginning of the end for the zone. The long, drawn-out and divisive process of handing over the canal to Panama began. Famously, Ronald Reagan would oppose this in the 70s, while Republican Senator Hayakawa cheekily claimed, quote, "I think we should keep it. We stole it, fair and square," end quote. It would be Jimmy Carter who would finally sign a treaty in 1979 to transfer the canal to Panama in 2000. By 1988, the clock was ticking down to the handover. America wanted a stable, friendly, and hopefully democratic Panama, able to maintain and run the canal. But Panama was instead entering one of the darkest periods in its history. At the center of it all was a figure the US had trained and supported for decades. Washington, D.C. was ruining the day they had ever dealt with the man his people called Cara del Pina, or Pineapple Face. Manuel Noriega was a truly despicable human being. He was a thug, a violent alcoholic who enjoyed raping women. Former Assistant Secretary of State Elliot Abrams recalled the dictator as, quote, "a remarkably ugly man whose true nature showed through, greasy and thoroughly off-putting," end quote. Even the straight-laced General Colin Powell, not normally a man given to hyperbole, recalled, quote, "I found Noriega an unappealing man with his pock-marked face, beady, darting eyes, and arrogant swagger. I immediately had the crawling sense that I was in the presence of evil," end quote. Noriega was born on February the 11th in either 1934, 1936, or 1938, depending on who you ask. The product of a well-to-do lawyer's tryst with the family maid, he was considered an illegitimate child and spent the first years of his life with his mother in a village tucked within the Panamanian jungle. Then, tragedy struck. When he was a toddler, Manuel's mother developed tuberculosis and could no longer care for him. Rejected by his own father, the young boy was put up for adoption, before eventually being taken in by his godmother. By the age of 5, both his parents were dead. Hundreds of miles away from the idyllic village of his early childhood, Manuel suddenly found himself in the terraplane slum of Panama City. Despite this, he was admitted to the Instituto Nacional, a prestigious high school that produced several political leaders. Though he excelled in his studies, Manuel was often bullied for his acne-pocked skin, with fellow students calling him cara de pina, or pineapple face. Here, he joined the Young Socialists, writing articles condemning the US and its hold on the Panama Canal. Whether his heart was truly in this can be doubted, as he was already selling out his comrades to the CIA for pocket change. His heroes were also a source of concern for the future, Chairman Mao and Genghis Khan. In 1958, after failing to get into medical school, Noriega won a scholarship to a military academy in Peru, joining the Panamanian National Guard. It was here that his life took a drastic turn as he made friends with his commanding officer, Omar Torrijos, the future strongman of Panama. He was repeatedly in trouble for brawling and faced multiple accusations of raping girls as young as 13, but always wriggled out of trouble thanks to his mentor. After one particularly horrific incident, Torrijos sent his protege to the US-run School of the Americas until the heat died down. Based in the Canal Zone, this school is infamous today, denounced by critics as a school for assassins. It trained generations of Latin American and Caribbean military officers in torture tactics, psychological warfare, and counterinsurgency. Its alumni include a veritable who's who of dictators, war criminals, torturers, and drug lords. Here, Noriega showed a natural talent for psychological warfare, impressing his trainers. Finishing the enlightening lessons on how to repress your own people, he headed back to Panama to try out his new skills. The school is still around today, with some 21st century rebranding. Its name is now the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, and it has moved to Fort Benning, Georgia. The curriculum even includes a single lesson on human rights now. Gee whiz. But, as the Pentagon Inspector General reported, quote, the curriculum remained largely unchanged from the School of Americas, despite the new title, end quote. Noriega's career now went into hyperdrive as his sugar daddy, Torrijos, seized power in a coup in 1968. He made Noriega his chief of intelligence, and their double act now held Panama in an iron grip. Torrijos was the good cop, a flamboyant populist, passing social reforms and negotiating the return of the canal, all the while drinking heavily, smoking huge Havana cigars, and entertaining a huge harem of beautiful mistresses. Funny story. At the official signing ceremony for the Panama Canal Treaty, he got up to make a speech, but was obviously roaring drunk. The horrified US officials looked on as he slurred his words, lost track of where he was, and clutched the podium as he swayed from side to side. International relations were fun back then. Noriega was the bad cop, Torrijos' enforcer. Regime opponents had a nasty habit of disappearing and never being seen again. For example, Roman Catholic priest Jesus Hector Gallego Herrera was kidnapped, murdered, and his body thrown into the sea from a helicopter. At the same time, he was working for the CIA as a paid informant. Ironically, the head of the CIA at this time was future US President and Noriega nemesis, George Bush. Noriega was getting $100,000 a year from the US taxpayers. 2 jobs wasn't enough for the pineapple, however. He added the title of drug lord to his ever-growing repertoire. As early as 1971, American law enforcement officials rated Noriega one of the world's biggest narco-traffickers, and in 1972 proposed his, quote, total and complete immobilization, end quote, a euphemism for assassination. It was blocked by the CIA. They didn't want to lose their chief asset in Panama. Life was good for Noriega, and it was about to get even better. Torrijos died in an airplane crash. There are many conspiracy theories about him being assassinated by the US or Noriega. but it does seem to have been a real accident. With his mentor dead, the pineapple took over Panama. He didn't become president. Instead, he preferred to rule from the shadows and put flunkies nominally in charge. Now, the undeclared strongman of Panama, Noriega soon reached Bond villain levels of extravagance and criminality. He turned Panama into a true narco-state. He did deals with Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel and its rival, the Cali cartel, allowing them to use Tocumen Airport for smuggling cocaine into the US in exchange for $1,000 per kilo. Soon, 80% of Colombia's cocaine was going through Panama. It wasn't just a trafficking route, it was a huge laundromat for drug cash. Billions went through the nation's banking system, while the capital, Panama City, had a mysterious building boom in luxury real estate. Locals were soon calling these cocaine towers. He occasionally cracked down on minor dealers and small shipments, claiming to support America's war on drugs. Washington, D.C. pretended to believe him, with the Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA, giving him commendations for his excellent work against drug trafficking right up until 1987. They were prepared to turn a blind eye as Noriega had become the linchpin of their anti-communist efforts in Latin America. In Nicaragua, the pro-American Somoza regime had fallen to the Marxist Sandinistas. Worried Soviet influence would spread in their backyard, President Ronald Reagan began sponsoring the Contras, right-wing enemies of the new Nicaraguan regime. As this increasingly controversial secret war went on, Noriega was vital to keeping it going. For this service, the CIA paid him $200,000 a year and defended him against his American critics. But US officials knew he was a mercenary, willing to sell anyone for a few dollars. Secretary of State George Shultz observed that, quote, "You can't buy Noriega, you can only rent him," end quote. Despite being an ally of the free world against communism, he was quite happy to do deals with America's enemies. Even as Noriega helped the Contras, he was simultaneously shipping arms to the Marxist rebels in El Salvador who opposed the US-backed government. He was also known to be passing classified information to Cuba, Libya, and Warsaw Pact states. By 1987, Noriega was dealing outright with terrorist organizations such as the more radical factions of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Colombian M19 group. He was an equal opportunity arms dealer. Noriega was on top of the world, ruler of Panama, an $800 million fortune hidden away, playing all sides to his own benefit. Yet the seeds of his downfall were already being sown. Panama had always been fairly authoritarian, but under the pineapple, the violence was much more out in the open and visible. The fate of regime critic Hugo Spadafora in 1985 was particularly horrifying. Kidnapped off the streets by a pro-Noriega thug nicknamed Bruce Lee, his decapitated body was later found in a US Postal Service bag in neighbouring Costa Rica. He had been brutally tortured, with his thigh muscles neatly sliced, so he could not close his legs, and then something had been jammed up his rectum, tearing it apart. His head was then cut off while he was still alive. On his back was scratched F8, a reference to the 8th Force, a Panamanian death squad. Noriega proclaimed his innocence, but tapes were later revealed of him talking to the leader of the kidnappers. The flunky told Pineapple Face, quote, "We have the rabid dog," end quote. Without hesitation, the dictator replied, "And what does one do with a dog that has rabies?" End quote. The murder was a step too far, damaging Noriega's standing in the US and at home. The Cold War was also beginning to wind down. The pineapple was no longer so useful to Washington, D.C. Panama's previously close relationship with the US began to collapse, and by 1987, American aid had been cut. The CIA even stopped paying Noriega's salary. Then, in 1988, the American government finally discovered, horrors of horrors, that Noriega was a drug trafficker. Of course, it had known about this for 2 decades, but now it acted like a wronged innocent, taken advantage of by a swarthy foreign conman. On February the 4th, 1988, 2 separate grand juries indicted the dictator on drug trafficking and associated racketeering charges. The sentences for Noriega, if convicted, were a grand total of 145 years. Noriega didn't take this lying down. He responded by ordering his henchmen to harass US military personnel and their dependents stationed in the Canal Zone. There were 600 incidents reported from February 1988 to May 1989. The incident reports sound like something out of a medieval torture chamber. Broken fingers, loosened teeth, abrasions from billy clubs, rubber hoses and pistols, strip searches, prolonged detentions, robberies, and fondling of female military personnel. The worst incident came on March the 3rd, 1989, when armed PDF or Panamanian Defense Force soldiers pulled over 21 US school buses transporting hundreds of American schoolchildren, most of them under the age of 12, and held them at gunpoint for several hours. The crisis deteriorated even further after Panama's May 1989 presidential elections. Fearful of defeat, Noriega ordered the PDF and his personal paramilitary organization, the so-called Dignity Battalions, to seize the ballot boxes, close select polling stations, and intimidate the opposition and its supporters. When exit polls conducted by the Catholic Church still showed the opposition candidate ahead, Noriega quickly cancelled the elections and installed a crony as president. On May the 10th, the cheated opposition candidates organised a protest rally near Noriega's military headquarters, La Comandancia. What happened next would horrify the world. Thousands of Panamanians have filled the streets, showing their fury at Noriega. You are proud to join them, marching alongside cars honking their horns, yelling out with glee, "Down with the pineapple!" It's a carnival-like atmosphere. Freedom fills within your grasp. But then you see them, the red-shirted thugs of the Dignity Battalions. Their faces are pockmarked and scarred. They carry a motley collection of metal pipes, clubs and boards with nails in them. The crowd halts, but still shouts abuse at the regime goons. But then, at a signal from their leader, they charge at you shouting, "American lackeys!" The street is now a swirling mass of red-shirted thugs and terrified protesters. A particularly ugly goon swings his tire iron and it smashes into your shoulder, pain filling your body. You headbutt him in the face and he screams while clutching his bleeding nose. Up ahead, the vice presidential candidate is being hounded by a mob of red-shirted thugs, his white shirt drenched in blood, terror in his eyes as the blows rain down upon him. Images of the violence went around the world, especially the savage beating of the vice presidential candidate, Billy Ford. Noriega had become an embarrassment to his former allies. American troops, civilians and children were being harassed. Drugs were flowing into the US via Panama, causing a crack epidemic and soaring crime levels in the cities. He was openly dealing with America's enemies, and in just 11 years' time, this was the man who would get his hands on the Panama Canal? He had to be dealt with, one way or another. In May 1988, Ronald Reagan declared that, quote, "Noriega must go," end quote. But the question of how to remove the dictator proved to be far more difficult to resolve. Rather like how America captured Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro, a commando raid to seize Noriega was the preferred option. The problem was that he'd been trained by America, and he knew This was their go-to option, and rarely stayed in one place for too long. Plus, all those American troops and civilians in the Canal Zone suddenly looked like potential hostages. As the US dithered, weird plans began to be proposed to fill the vacuum. Perhaps the worst one came from a Special Forces soldier famed for his skydiving expertise. He claimed to have trained Noriega when he was at the School of the Americas and had been friendly with the future dictator. His so-called plan was to walk up to Noriega's official residence, remind him of the good old days, and challenge him to a friendly skydiving competition. Then he would make sure that Noriega landed on American territory and could be arrested. This ludicrous plan made it ridiculously far through the bureaucracy before eventually being shot down. Another crazy scheme was to send a beautiful CIA agent skilled in the arts of lovemaking to seduce, drug, and kidnap the dictator. It had all the makings of a great 80s movie, but apparently the CIA had no such agent. Real life can be so disappointing. Unwilling to take direct action themselves, they settled for raising the pressure on the pineapple. Operation Nimrod Dancer began, with aggressive US military maneuvers in the Canal Zone. It was a psychological warfare tactic to break the dictator's will. There were two problems with this, however. Firstly, they had trained Noriega in psychological warfare, and he was an expert in it. He'd even written a well-received book on the subject. Secondly, years of being Panama's El Jefe had left him delusional. He once told an American interviewer that he envisioned himself portrayed in the movies by Clint Eastwood because, quote, he is very macho. He doesn't take anything from anybody, end quote. During one American exercise involving US military police, Noriega showed up in an entourage and directly approached the US forces. He shook hands with one military policeman and in front of the Panamanian cameras offered himself up for arrest. Here I am, he taunted. Noriega was not arrested. One US general, after the fact, even described the dictator's handling of US pressure as, quote, magnificent, end quote. If Noriega wasn't going to break, maybe the PDF could be persuaded to overthrow him instead. President George Bush, Noriega's former CIA boss, made this explicit. At a press conference, he was asked what Panamanians should do about the dictator. The president replied, quote, they ought to just do everything they can to get Mr. Noriega out of there, end quote. 4 months later, the coup the Americans wanted finally came. Sadly, it was one of the most amateurish efforts in history. Major Moises Hirodi wanted a bloodless coup. Noriega would not be killed or arrested. Instead, he would be detained in his own commandancia and convinced to retire. US General Max Furman quickly concluded the coup was, quote, ill-motivated, ill-conceived, ill-led, and fatally flawed, end quote. They did catch a pineapple face, but then they detained him alone in a room with a telephone which he used to call in loyal PDF units. After a fierce battle, the rebels were overwhelmed and the tyrant was freed. Emerging from the battered, bullet-scarred commandancia, he declared himself God's favourite. He raised his right arm in a clenched fist salute and yelled, quote, the Americans did this. The piranhas did this. They want to finish Panama, end quote. By the time President Bush and his advisors had thoroughly discussed their options, the coup was over, and Hirodi was as dead as a dodo. A humiliated White House could only look on as Noriega raised the stakes again. He had his puppet National Assembly declare him maximum leader of national liberation and head of government. The puppet master had finally left the shadows. The Assembly proceeded to pass a resolution declaring Panama to be in a state of war with the United States. Noriega strode triumphantly to the podium, wielding a large machete, and boasted, quote, We, the Panamanian people, will sit along the banks of the canal to watch the dead bodies of our enemies pass by." End quote. It was more political theatre than anything else. No American commanders or policymakers took it very seriously. The next evening, tragedy struck. As you drive away from Fort Clayton and enter Panama City, it's with a sense of relief, of finally getting some rest and relaxation. The four of you are US Marines, and you have been cooped up on base for weeks due to the deteriorating relations with Pineapple Face. Now, you're going to enjoy a well-deserved slap-up meal at the Marriott Hotel. The radio plays a soulful Latin tune as you drive along the twisting, darkened streets of Panama. It's then that you see the roadblock up ahead and the armed men surrounding it. Damn it, these aren't the normal Noriega goons either. They're the notorious killers of the Macho Del Monte. As you show your US military IDs, the sentry sneers at you. "American pigs, come to spy on our great leader. You should go back where you came from," shoving an AK-47 into your ribs. "That's all politics, far above my pay grade. We're just going out for a good time," you reply, watching as a crowd forms and more armed men appear. The sentry talks to them in Spanish, and you catch the words "American spies" as he gestures towards your car. The tension is so thick you could cut it with a knife. As even more armed men arrive, your fellow Marine, Haddad, turns around and whispers, "Shall we make a run for it?" You all agree. Taking advantage of the distracted guards, you leap into the car, and Haddad puts the pedal to the metal as you speed away from the roadblock. Screams of "The Americans are escaping!" closely followed by the chatter of machine guns. The bullets shatter the back window and ricochet off the metal exterior. As the roadblock disappears behind you, you thank God that you got out of there alive. But when you turn to the Marine next to you, Roberto, you see that he's been hit, and that red blood is rapidly soaking his clothes. 24-year-old Marine Corps Lieutenant Roberto Paz died before he could reach medical attention. The shooting was witnessed by an American naval officer and his wife, who had been stopped at the same checkpoint about half an hour earlier. They were blindfolded and driven to an unknown location, where for the next 4 hours the lieutenant was repeatedly kicked in the head and groin, as his wife was forced to watch. The PDF soldiers also threw her against a wall and threatened to rape her. Finally, at about 1 a.m., December the 17th, the goons gave up and released the couple 3 blocks from the commandancia. It was the final straw. Sunday, December the 17th, 1989, was supposed to be a day of celebration. At 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the halls of the White House were festively decked as President George H.W. Bush entertained old friends and family at one of the Bush's numerous Christmas parties. The normally reserved president embodied the festive spirit, wearing bright red socks, one emblazoned with the word Merry, the other with Christmas. At 2 p.m., as carolers in 18th century costume entertained the guests, Bush politely excused himself and headed upstairs to the second-floor residence for a council of war. It only took an hour and 50 minutes for the decision to be made. Operation Just Cause was green-lit. 27,000 US forces, including the 13,000 already stationed in the Canal Zone, along with 300 aircraft, were going to invade. The PDF, Noriega's paramilitaries, and his whole regime was to be smashed into the ground. Then they would hunt down Pineapple Face, once and for all. It would be the largest US military operation since the fall of Saigon. The core of the invasion force would be 4,000 Special Operations troops. Green Berets, SEALs, Rangers, Air Force Commandos, and Delta Force that would execute a series of raids all over Panama. The date was set for December the 20th at 1 a.m. The timing of the operation turned out to be the worst kept secret in Panama. CNN and all the American news networks were reporting on the invasion long before it had begun. At midnight, the Commandancia sent out a message to PDF commanders, quote, "They're coming. The ball game is at 1 a.m. Report to your units, draw your weapons, and prepare to fight." End quote. The attack on the Commandancia began 50 minutes early at 12:45, mainly because the operation had already been revealed. As the Americans advanced into Panama City, they were met by barricades and sniper fire. It was a tough fight for the La Commandancia, despite the building turning into a blazing inferno as helicopter gunships pounded it. Resistance was fanatical and seemingly coming from everywhere. The lead helicopter, an AH-6 Light Bird, was shot down and crashed into the courtyard of the PDF headquarters. As the battle raged on, Operation Acid Gambit was launched to rescue an American hostage called Kurt Muse. As we saw in the opening dramatization, the rescue was a success, but the chopper was shot down and virtually everyone inside was injured apart from Kurt. They were later rescued and flown out. Friendly fire was a real problem. Most of the pilots were using night vision devices to fly their aircraft and identify their targets, but the increasing amount of smoke and frequent flashes from explosions and fires often obscured subtle differences between friend and foe, especially where there was no clearly defined front lines and hostile fire came from many directions. This led to 2 separate incidents of the AC-130 gunships firing on the US forces attacking the PDF headquarters, which resulted in 21 men wounded in action. The surrounding El Chorrillo neighborhood also caught fire and was mostly burned to the ground, causing a huge flood of terrified refugees to flood past the Commandancia, allowing the remaining PDF defenders to escape. After the fight was over, the area was so devastated it was called Little Hiroshima by reporters. Meanwhile, further operations were launched to cut off potential escape routes for Noriega. 2 combat rubber raider craft departed Robben Naval Station at 11 p.m. They silently crossed the canal in the darkness and tied up in a mangrove stand near the docks at Balboa Harbour. 2 two-man SEAL teams slipped over the sides of the crafts and, using sophisticated scuba gear that left no trail or air bubbles, swam to their target, the Panamanian fast patrol boat Presidente Porras, which US commanders feared Noriega would use to flee Panama. The SEAL demolition teams placed haversacks filled with explosives in the propeller shaft, set the detonators for 1 a.m. and quickly swam away to their extraction point. Above the water's surface, they could already hear the roar of the initial firefights erupting between the US and PDF forces. At 1 a.m., the explosion ripped a hole in the Presidente Porras, throwing the ship up into the air. In their enthusiasm, the SEALs had used a tad too much explosive. However, the Presidente Porras soon sank beneath the waves. As one team of SEALs was navigating the waters of Balboa Harbour, SEAL Team 4 was coming ashore at Panama City's downtown Paitilla Airport, where Noriega based his personal Learjet. At 12:45 a.m., the 62-man force, comprised of 3 16-man SEAL platoons and a command element led by Lieutenant Commander Pat Toohey, came ashore. The SEALs hurried up the trail from the beach and snuck through a hole in the airport security fence. Their target was the 3 northernmost hangars, but as they got into position, clinging to the tarmac, their radios suddenly crackled into life. 3 PDF armoured vehicles were racing down the road that circled the northern end of the airfield. Now a mistake was made. A SEAL platoon was ordered to the road to either ensure the vehicles passed by the airport or, if necessary, ambush and take them out. As the SEAL team rose from the tarmac, a Panamanian guard in the northernmost hangar saw them and raised his weapon. A SEAL fired first, but missed. A split second later, the crackle of AK-47 fire echoed through the humid night as the guard fired a burst on automatic. The bullets ripped through the line of exposed SEALs, 2 of whom were killed instantly. The remaining SEALs dove for cover in a drainage ditch, but were struck by shots ricocheting off the tarmac, wounding 6 more. The SEALs in front of Noriega's hangar unleashed a hail of covering fire at the northern hangar, which now appeared to hold at least 2 Panamanians, but their line of fire was obstructed by 2 small aircraft parked in the front of the hangar. The 3rd platoon, to the south, was ordered up to attack the hangar. A minute of intense fire gave way to heavy silence. The hangar was riddled with bullet holes. The Panamanians were dead, and anti-armor rockets had destroyed the cockpit of Noriega's plane. But although SEAL Team 4 achieved its objective, it had paid a steep price. 4 SEALs were dead, and 8 more wounded. The unexpected casualties from such an elite force shocked the Special Forces community and will remain a source of controversy for years. In addition to cutting off Noriega's avenues of escape, another critical mission was to destroy the units that had come to his rescue during the October coup. The 7th Infantry Company and Battalion 2000. The black uniformed and bearded Macho de Monte, literally mountain men of the 7th Infantry, were a well-armed commando unit trained by Cuban advisors for a single purpose: to protect, and if necessary, rescue Noriega. They were stationed at Rio Hato, about 65 miles from Panama City on the Pacific coast. But as demonstrated during the coup, they were able to rapidly deploy by air to the capital. The mission of attacking Rio Hato was given to the U.S. Army's elite light infantry, the 75th Ranger Regiment, under Colonel William F. Buck Kernan. At precisely 1 a.m., 2 stealth bombers, in their first ever combat mission, swooped in like bats at 4,000 feet to drop a pair of 2,000-pound bombs next to the 7th Infantry's barracks. The idea was to terrify and confuse the Panamanians into surrendering quickly. Yet instead of stunning the Macho de Monte, the massive bombs roused the Panamanians from their beds and out of their barracks, as the mountain men moved into position and prepared to fight. Flying towards them were 13 transport planes carrying 1,300 Rangers from the 2nd and 3rd Ranger Battalions. As the 7-hour flight neared its end, some Rangers could no longer hold back their bowels, and others vomited, filling the planes with a foul stench. Sounds lovely. 21-year-old Ranger Nick Ben-Shail recalled that he was mystified by the weird sounds on the outside of the plane, shouting out to his comrades, quote, "What kind of noise is this plane making? It sounds like there's about 500 gremlins with huge pipe wrenches that are beating the shit out of our plane." End quote. As they prepared to jump, he soon realized the problem. The air was filled with tracer rounds from the Panamanian air defenses. The Rangers jumped from an altitude of only 500 feet, 300 feet below the standard training jump. This meant their main parachutes would open at just 100 feet. While limiting their exposure to ground fire, it also meant their reserve parachutes were virtually useless in case of a malfunction. and with their 100-pound packs strapped to their backs, every ranger was assured a brutal landing. The ground hurtles towards you, your parachute seemingly useless in slowing your descent. As you hit the floor with a jolt, pain surges through your body. You're lucky though. Another ranger lands with a thud, breaking his back, screaming out in pain. Panamanian machine guns open up and silence his cries. Trying to get your bearings as more rangers crash to the ground. Trucks pour down the tarmac of the runway, their emergency lights whirling as they fire a wall of lead at your comrades. Pulling out your anti-tank gun, you get a shot off just in time before they spot you. The missile strikes true, with the lead truck exploding in a fireball and cartwheeling through the sky. As more missiles drive back the trucks, a ranger smashes into the ground next to you and doesn't move. Fearing the worst, you run over, only for him to spring up and shout, "Get your hands off me, Sergeant!" as he sprints off into the darkness. You look on with bewilderment until more gunshots echo out from the barracks up ahead. Grimly, you head off towards the sound of the guns. It's been a crazy time already, and it's not over yet. This was based on the real experiences of Sergeant Doug Spear, one of the first Rangers to land. Although the runway was cleared within 30 minutes, the fighting in the barracks area was intense. The PDF withdrew through the rear of the building and took up firing positions in nearby gullies or trenches. When the Rangers emerged from the building's exit, the PDF ambushed them and then withdrew to the next building to repeat the tactic. It took 5 hours of room-to-room, building-to-building combat, but finally the mountain men were either dead, had surrendered, or had melted into the surrounding jungle. 4 soldiers were killed on the jump, and another 86 formed part of a, quote, orthopedic nightmare, end quote, of broken legs and ankles. But they had killed 34 Panamanian soldiers and captured 362. The other PDF unit that concerned the US commanders was Battalion 2000, an elite fighting unit of 200 mechanized infantry that had smashed the abortive October coup. One of Noriega's most loyal units, they were stationed at Fort Cimarron, just 16 miles from Panama City's Torrijos Tocumen Airport, which could serve as either an escape hatch for Noriega or a possible entry point for Cuban or Nicaraguan reinforcements. The race was on to seize the airport before Battalion 2000 could secure it. However, Battalion 2000 responded quicker than the Americans had thought. As they headed towards the airport, unwelcome news came in that a 10-vehicle convoy had left the Cimarron fort and was heading straight for the airport. The only way to stop them was to capture the vital Bacora River Bridge and stop them from crossing. It was now a race against time between the Green Berets and the Panamanians to see who could get to the bridge first. Helicopters dropped off the Green Berets on the western shore of the river. As they clambered up the steep slopes to the road, they found themselves directly in the headlights of the first PDF vehicle crossing the bridge from the east. The soldiers hit the lead vehicle with 2 light anti-tank weapons and poured machine gun fire and grenades into the column. It rapidly turned into a 7-hour battle as Battalion 2000 attempted to outflank the small group of Americans protecting the bridge. But the Green Berets lived up to the reputation. They repelled every PDF attempt, to either cross the bridge or the river. Meanwhile, 11 transport aircraft approached Tocumen airfield in a straight line over the runway. At 1:03 a.m., the clear evening sky filled with the dark silhouettes of parachutes as the 1st Ranger Battalion jumped from the planes. On the ground, things were rapidly getting more complicated. A Brazilian passenger plane had landed. Soon, screaming came from the terminal as Panamanian soldiers began to separate mothers from their babies, planning to use them as hostages. It was another tough fight, but by dawn the Rangers secured all their targets and had freed the airline passengers that were being held hostage. In return, they suffered 4 deaths, 2 from friendly fire, plus 27 wounded in action, and 3 dozen Rangers who'd been injured in the parachute jumps. With the main target secured and Noriega's best units neutralized, the fighting after the first day dropped in intensity. The PDF began to fall apart, and its generals bugged out. In Panama City and Colón, the major urban areas, American troops were suddenly in control, and it was a bizarre experience for the troops on the ground. In many ways, it was rather like Baghdad when it first fell in 2003. American units would enter one street to find civilians shouting, "Viva Bush! Viva the United States!" and partying. In the next, they would face bullets from snipers. Everywhere, former soldiers, civilians, and regime thugs were looting to their heart's content. There was just one problem for the Americans. Where in the world was Manuel Noriega? Pineapple Face seemed to have vanished off the face of the earth. A $1 million reward was put on his head. The US media, of course, took this issue very seriously and reported it in a sober fashion. No, of course they didn't. There was breathless speculation that Noriega had fled to Cuba, or that he had built a Bond villain-style lair deep in the jungle, where he was plotting his comeback. Sadly, the truth was far less glamorous. Ironically, Noriega had dismissed the news reports of an American invasion as another psychological warfare tactic. Completely unconcerned, he was more interested in some rest and relaxation, heading to an officers' club on Tocumen airfield. He got rip-roaring drunk and demanded that a flunky bring him a prostitute. It was while he was engaged in an athletic session with said prostitute that the invasion began. Noriega's bodyguard, Captain Ivan Castillo, went outside after he heard helicopters and gunshots, and saw the sky filled with 750 parachutes descending upon the airfield. Castillo rushed back inside and dragged his boss off the prostitute. The dictator's entourage hurriedly piled into 2 Hyundai hatchbacks. The Maximin leader was clad in just his underwear, a skimpy robe, and some flip-flops. US Rangers actually shot out the front tyres of the first Hyundai as they hurtled towards the roadblock. Unfortunately, unaware that the dictator was in the back seat, they let the second vehicle escape. The next day, when the Rangers secured the recreation centre, they found Noriega's uniform and shoes. Administration and military officials tried to downplay the significance of the missing Noriega. On December the 20th, Powell declared, quote, "The operation is a success already because we cut off the head of that government, and there is a new government that was elected by the Panamanian people." End quote. But privately, they were deeply concerned. Vietnam was still very much in their minds. What if Noriega really was in some jungle base, plotting a long-term guerrilla war? His thugs from the Dignity battalions hadn't all been neutralized yet, and they were sniping at US forces. As Delta forces hunted for Noriega, they had little success, but did make a series of increasingly weird discoveries. At Noriega's residence at Fort Amador, US troops found pictures of Hitler, an extensive pornography collection, a witch's diary chronicling visits by 2 voodoo priestesses from Brazil, and 50 kilograms of white powder, initially believed to be cocaine, but later identified as flour for making tamales. At Noriega's home at Altos de Golfo, Delta uncovered more stacks of hardcore pornography, $8 million in US currency, and 2 religious altars, one of which was decorated with jars containing human internal organs. After days of kicking down doors and poring through windows, all they had discovered was that the pineapple was a connoisseur of 70s and 80s porn. Noriega was actually hiding out at his secretary's apartment in Panama City, where her flamboyant lounge singer husband was driving everybody crazy with endless renditions of Frank Sinatra's Fly Me to the Moon. Finally, early on the morning of December the 24th, Castillo had had enough. He went outside and tried to find some American soldiers so he could hand over his boss. Unfortunately, the soldiers he did find didn't speak Spanish, and they took him into custody as a prisoner of war before he could divulge the dictator's location. Noriega was deeply depressed, slowly being abandoned by everyone. The US military was conducting Bell operations, named after the massive US phone company. In order to avoid direct attacks on the remaining PDF garrisons and prevent further casualties, they were telephoning the Panamanian commander at each barracks and giving him an ultimatum to surrender peacefully or face the consequences. Most chose to surrender. In fact, 14 garrisons and 2,000 PDF troops surrendered thanks to these calls. In his direst hour, the pineapple now turned to an odd source for sanctuary. He had a very complex relationship with the Catholic Church. Though he kept pictures of 2 popes on his office desk, he claimed to be a Buddhist and was known to practice black voodoo. Yet, in his hour of need, it was to the Vatican he turned. Contacting the papal nuncio to Panama, Monsignor Loboa, he asked him to pick him up, of all places, the Panama City Dairy Queen. There, God's favourite, a visibly exhausted Noriega, wearing a t-shirt, Bermuda shorts, and an oversized baseball cap, jumped into the back seat of the car and sank low in his seat to avoid being seen on the short drive to the nunciature. Manuel Noriega had begun the invasion with a prostitute. He would end it surrounded by nuns. The dictator was disarmed and confined to a bare bedroom with no air conditioning and a broken television set, and strictly no alcohol. This was a nightmare for the alcoholic Noriega. When Delta Force and the US Army arrived at the nunciature, they deployed their weapons outward to deter a rescue attempt. For the next week and a half, they surrounded the building, attempting to persuade either Noriega to surrender or the Vatican to deny him asylum. On Christmas morning, General Max Furman, the commander of Southern Command, spoke personally with Loboa at the nunciature's gate. American officers noticed that the third-floor balcony of the Holiday Inn, less than 100 yards away, was filled with reporters holding long boom mics directed at the nunciature. In order to prevent eavesdropping, Furman ordered loudspeakers be directed to create a sound barrier. What happened next is the most famous part of Operation Just Cause, using documentary after documentary as an example of sinister American military psychological warfare. Yet in reality, this episode was more a farce than anything else. The PSYOP soldiers were all young men with little oversight, behaving like fraternity pranksters, rather than sinister practitioners of the dark arts of manipulation. As Delta Commander Jerry Boykin recalled, quote, "Being 20-year-olds, the PSYOPs guys started playing loud rock music, really loud," end quote. As it blared around the clock, it occurred to somebody that the music could be used to agitate Noriega. They created a playlist heavy on ironically titled songs such as Voodoo Child, You're No Good, and I Fought the Law. This fascinated reporters, who spent countless hours discussing the psychology behind the various song choices, the possible effects on Noriega, and demanding more information on this deadly new US tactic. Furman, leaping on the bandwagon, claimed it was all his idea, proudly boasting to reporters, quote, "I am the music man," end quote. That's one of the stranger declarations from a US commander. In reality, there was no psychology behind it, just the imaginations of a group of 20-year-olds. It didn't actually achieve anything. Noriega slept through it quite easily. It did really annoy the poor nuns, however, used to a life of quiet contemplation rather than blaring 80s rock. After just 2 days, Noreiga insisted the music stop, and it was replaced by Spanish language reports with stories of surrendering PDF commanders. However, the speakers were now turned down so low that Noriega couldn't actually hear them. I'm afraid the tales of rock music breaking Noriega's will to fight on are grossly exaggerated. In fact, the main reason the pineapple surrendered was the skillful manipulations of Balboa. On January the 3rd, a crowd of more than 10,000 Panamanians descended upon the Avenue Balboa to demonstrate. They banged pots and waved white handkerchiefs, shouting, "Kill the Hitler! Justice for the tyrant!" Some skewered pineapples on long sticks and pumped them up and down in the air, taunting, "Pineapple face! Pineapple face!" Balboa showed Noriega the crowds and darkly hinted that if they stormed the embassy, he would suffer the same fate as Mussolini, killed and his body strung up before his people. Then he landed the killer blow, quote, "Do you really want to spend the rest of your life having nuns wash your underwear?" End quote. The answer was no. The dictator was out of options. Just before 9 p.m. on January the 3rd, Noriega emerged from his refuge, wearing a wrinkled tan uniform with 4 stars on each shoulder board. Carrying a Bible and a toothbrush, he looked stunned and submissive in the glare of the television camera lights. He announced, quote, "I am General Noriega, and I am surrendering to U.S. forces." End quote. Within 2 hours, the man who had controlled a tropical paradise as the maximum leader was on the ground in the United States, heading to a Miami jail cell as prisoner number 41586. The tyrant had been toppled in just over a month, but it had come at a steep price. 23 Americans had been killed, and 323 were wounded. Meanwhile, 314 PDF soldiers were dead, while Panamanian civilian casualties are estimated at anywhere between 202 and 4,000. I lean towards the higher estimates, as a lot of the fighting took place in heavily populated built-up areas such as Panama City. In 1992, Noriega was convicted of drug trafficking charges and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Later, he was extradited to France and then back to Panama, where he died in 2017. Tactically, Operation Just Cause was a triumph of combined arms, a massive step up from Vietnam and the invasion of Grenada. The various services worked well together, foreshadowing the overwhelming success of the future First Gulf War. We need shed no tears for Pineapple Face. He was a brutal narco-tyrant, and Panama was better off without him. But it must be remembered that he was very much an American creation who backfired on them. From flooding the US with cocaine to plotting with their enemies, he is a cautionary tale of what can happen when you work with amoral thugs. Thank you for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. In our next episode, we head to the deserts of Jordan, where conflict is brewing. As the Jordanian monarchy and the PLO face off, a mass hijacking will provoke a civil war that will change the Middle East forever. Join me for the tale of Black September. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.